Good afternoon. How are you all? I'm hoping you can hear me still. So, just so you know, I'm going to read this to you guys, but I was told I got to keep my mask on, so I'm going to do my best. If I have to dip it down a little bit here in a minute, I may have to, but I'll do my best. But anyway, I'm just supposed to encourage you guys to wear face coverings over your mouth and nose while on Wichita State campus, hallways, public spaces, classrooms, etc., any campus buildings. So there you go. There's the PSA for that today. Hopefully you've got, and I know you do, have a handout today. towards the towards the last 2 weeks especially, I'll do my very best to give kind of a bit of a bigger bibliography on films and books. Are you hearing me okay? I feel from where I stand, it feels a little muffled, but I'm going to do my best. But today we're going to talk specifically about 4 films, and we're going to see some clips. And if the clips work the way we want them to work, sometimes I may not show you the whole thing, but I really wanted to this week show you some things. I know some of you guys, maybe almost all of you guys, have seen a lot of the movies that we'll talk about, but I still want to show them because I want to talk about innovations in those films or interesting concepts in the films. And remember that the film itself or the class itself is called History in Film, and you guys, I think all of you were here last week. Hopefully, almost all of you were here last week. But I should say again, I'm Ken Spurgeon, and I kind of give you a backstory of my interest in film, and of course, my degrees are in history, and I teach at Friends. But anyway, I want to get to the ideas of the kind of a chronology of film or history in film. Somebody said, I've had students who've said to me several times that I'm very much I know I'm a storyteller. I like being a storyteller, but they've talked about how they like the fact that I put things in order. My mind works that way. I'd love to take credit for that, but my mind works that way. I need to kind of see the foundational elements that, build upon each other. And so that's how I think. So that's a little bit of where we're going to go today. So last week we talked about Birth of a Nation, and we talked about All Quiet on the Western Front. There's so many films, by the way. I've already had some of you guys come up to me and say, what about this film? Man, there's so many films. If I leave any film off my list for this 4 weeks that you guys love, during Q&A or whatever, please bring it up and talk to us about it, because it's not that I don't like them, because I can think of 20 more like right away that I won't be talking about. So there's lots of good films. So anyway, I kind of titled this week Sound, Color, and Freedom. And the reason why is because in films like the one you're looking at right now, Gone with the Wind, which has been up on, in fact, I almost included the clip from recent conversation about Gone with the Wind, but I'll at least summarize it for you. But whether you're talking about Gone with the Wind, where you see innovation in color, in shots, and so much more, that's unique. Citizen Kane, that we're going to talk about today, you see innovations in certainly in the way the film was shot, but definitely in the freedom of the way the film was shot. They give Orson Welles a whole bunch of freedom, and they really gamble because he's a 25-year-old kid, which is incredible. Like this last week in preparing, I really got myself even more immersed in Orson Welles. I mean, I remember him growing up, and I know a lot of you all do. But in some respects, as a person who is kind of a filmmaker, I don't think he's been given his just due still, which sounds weird, but I just don't think people talk about him. And I think he's a genius. So I'll save that because that's coming. That's like the second film I'm going to talk about, I think, or third. And then we're going to talk about Sergeant York. And that's a little bit of a personal favorite, but it's also a film I want to talk about because of the history connections to it very much as well. And then The Grapes of Wrath. We're going to talk about The Grapes of Wrath. Now, these all come in about a 5-year period. I really think Hollywood in many ways kind of hit its stride in this era that we're talking about, 1937, 38 to about 1942. That's kind of the era we're in. If you keep notes or you want to keep notes, which for me, that's a good vehicle to keep my mind engaged, 37 to about 42. So before I get into the films themselves, let me give another little bit of an introduction. This period is so unique because, remember, you had 1915, Birth of a Nation. which we talked about. You had 1930, All Quiet on the Western Front, Academy Award winner, incredible film. I said still my favorite telling of that tale. When you get to 1937, 1938, which is at least the planning for these films, you're just coming out of the Great Depression. Think about how hard money is to come by. Think about how much money we'd say today, way too much money gets spent on entertainment. We're right? But think about the kind of money that's going to get spent on Gone with the Wind in 1939. It's astronomical. And I'm not talking about The Wizard of Oz, but it came out the same year. And it also jumped into Technicolor. They're going to attempt to color the film. So anyway, it's an interesting time. It's also an interesting time because it's in that window as the Depression ends and before World War II really gets going, at least for the United States. World War II is actually going for the world in 1939, but not yet the U.S. So some people call this era 1930s, I'd say 1938 to 1942, maybe more specifically. They kind of say Hollywood hit its full stride, meaning it became really a movie-making center, but it also became a kind of enormous movie-making center. And that means stars were coming like crazy. That means movies were getting bigger. Budgets were getting bigger. Experimentation was getting bigger. One of my articles that I didn't share with you guys, but I'll kind of summarize, talks about how many people showed up in Hollywood in 1935 that we know so well later. In the mid-30s. People like Jimmy Stewart, Henry Fonda, Maureen O'Hara, and countless others. We could think of a lot of them. John Wayne comes to his height here at this point too, or his rise begins in the mid-30s. So I'm not going to talk about all these, but I wanted to share these films with you because these films really, like I said, made Hollywood, kind of put Hollywood into its full stride. It transformed much of the way filmmaking would be made from here on out. And like I said, advances in sound. How so in sound? Well, we're going to get fully, in the early 30s, you begin singing cowboys. By the late 30s, you're getting soundtracks. It's happening. A lot of people think of musicals, and you're certainly right to think that. But you're getting true soundtracks, and no movie is more like in our mind soundtrack than Gone with the Wind. When I watch Gone with the Wind for the next 3 days, I'm like walking around going da na na na. I'm doing it, and I'm thinking, why am I doing that? It's stuck in our head. And of course, Wizard of Oz, right? These films are really transforming things. So I want to say something about the films on this list that I'm not going to talk about in detail. Some of them I think get overlooked. Stagecoach. So John Ford. Why don't you raise your hand if you knew who John Ford is? So people remember John Ford for Westerns. But one interesting thing about this particular era is that John Ford directs several movies that aren't Westerns. Now, Stagecoach is. But How Green Was My Valley is not. The Grapes of Wrath is not. And several others. Of course, in 1948, he directs The Quiet Man with John Wayne and Maureen O'Hara. So he wasn't completely an all-Western director. And I have mixed feelings about John Ford myself. I think he was a genius. I think I would never have wanted to be on a film set with him because I think he was kind of a jerk. No, I think he was a jerk. All accounts point to the fact that he was probably that. He was intense. He was intimidating. So I'm going to tell you a real quick story about Stagecoach and John Ford, because John Ford ends up directing several of these movies in this era, and we'll talk about him in The Grapes of Wrath later. When John Ford met John Wayne had been a prop guy. If you know the story, he played football for USC. He got injured. He was a prop guy. He was a big, hulking guy, and he went over and was moving props around on a film set. That's how he made his break. The story goes that John Ford and some others saw him. Of course, he gets in several kind of B movies, but John Ford saw him, and just purely on his presence, which there's always the debate about John Wayne, was he a good actor or did he have just a lot of presence, or both? But John Ford noticed, okay, that guy does not look like anybody else. When he walks on when he walks in my little lens, I cannot look away. And I would argue with you that that was true all through John Wayne's film life. John Wayne could walk into a scene and not say anything, and your eyes went, who's that guy? Now, that's that it factor, you know? Well, John Ford was a tough guy. And John Ford walked over to John Wayne and said, I heard you played football. John Wayne said, yep. He said, show me a three-point stance. John Wayne got down like a lineman, put his arm down on the ground, and John Ford kicked his arm out from under him. John Wayne, plopped into the ground. That was how they met. John Wayne got up, and the story goes that they got into it. John Wayne might have pushed him around or even shoved back. And then John Ford goes, yeah, I like you. So John Ford was unique. He had some people to John Wayne, John Ford became kind of his dad. John Wayne said later on, many times, John Wayne almost worshiped the ground Ford walked on because he thought anytime he does these things to me, he's doing them for my good. He's doing them for the good of the project or the film or whatever. Other people like Henry Fonda just endured him. Lots of people said they just endured him. And then some people said, I don't want to work with him. That's just a prelude to say, but he knew what he was doing many times. Stagecoach is the first example. So if you go back and watch Stagecoach, and again, we're not going to talk about it in depth, but I'm doing more than I should. Several times in that movie, you'll see action filmed differently than it was before. For example, you will see shots from above. I mean, today we think about air shots, drone shots, and all this stuff. But you'll see shots from above when things are coming underneath. That was kind of uncommon. You'll see shots from the ground. You'll see an actor run into the camera, almost run right into the camera and collapse right in front of the camera. So Ford is really moving the camera around. He's really using the canvas really well. And then you'll see him do some things interesting with tight shots too, the scenes inside the Stagecoach. Now, the reason I tell you this is because one of the people who watched Stagecoach and went, wow, was 23-year-old Orson Welles, who said he's doing some interesting stuff there. So like any great creator, and I'm going to tell you that I think Orson Welles is amazing. Things don't happen in a vacuum. We get ideas. Even the greatest get ideas. I mean, Michael Jordan didn't come up with all of his moves on his own. He was watching Dr. J and thinking. And it's true about all of us, writers, filmmakers, whatever. So I just want you to hear that. So Stagecoach, to some people, was one of the first films to really do things differently. But then you have these two massive films, The Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind. I won't talk about those two. I won't talk about them right now. Wizard of Oz, I know you know. Color comes along. It's the musical giant. Judy Garland is discovered. Then in 1940, this is interesting. So you've dabbled with color, but did you know that lots of people, after they dabbled with color, said, for one, it takes too long, it's too difficult. They had used film strips until the mid-30s if they tried it. They'd use this red and green kind of film strip thing. A lot of people said color takes away from the action. Color takes away from the drama. Color can't provide lighting and shadows like black and white. There was lots of those people who argued that all through the 40s. Orson Welles thought that when he made Citizen Kane. So Grapes of Wrath goes back and is black and white. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Have you seen that movie? I used to show that movie to my government class, and I was telling you last week about All Quiet on the Western Front. How do you test young people sometimes? If I put All Quiet on the Western Front on, 16-year-olds were riveted. When they watched Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, they were riveted. So those films have lasted the test of time. I love Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. I love Jimmy Stewart. Again, we won't talk about it in depth. It's got a lot of history in it. It's a fictional story. Then 41 is Citizen Kane, which we're going to talk about a lot later, and then Sergeant York in 41. Now, you can add more to this, and the irony of those movies I just put up, we all look at those today, and they're all classics. And I think all of these are on the top 100 films of all time. And yet some of them lost the Academy Award. And I forget if it's 40 or 41. I haven't thought about this recently, but How Green Was My Valley tops a couple of these films. And it's a good film, too, don't get me wrong. But it's funny how sometimes these films became more appreciated, more loved later, or as the years progressed. So let me tell you a little bit about what's happening with technology here before we get to the films. So I told you. Oops. I told you 1939 was a breakthrough year because of color. So what they did in the 30s from about 1935 to 1939 is they kind of messed around with tinting. And they used, first of all, they tried this red and green thing. I probably should have found an example to show you, but red and green strips, basically. The problem with that color palette is it would only give so many colors, and it did distort things a little bit, and it didn't give them the kind of color we see now, you know? I don't know if you've seen the more recent films, but nowadays you really can color old films in a way that looks real. But they couldn't in those days, and it was challenging. But finally, in the late 1930s, Technicolor comes along. And of course, this leads to The Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind trying it. Again, some argued that a color film would never equal the mood, and I mentioned this a second ago. They wanted to stay with that mood element that had been created in the early mid-30s, maybe in All Quiet on the Western Front, or films like that. So I'm sure some of you have heard of film noir, that idea of mood. And I still love them. I love watching black and white movies from the 40s, like Arsenic and Old Lace and those kind of movies. And they create, a great feeling. But people were arguing for that color would take away from all that that was not part of the art form. So now let's transition to the 4 films. So here's the beginning of our first film. I don't know how my time, this is my first time to do it quite this way, so I never know how my timing is going to work. But I do want you guys to know you can ask questions, or you can wait until the break. If you ask, raise your hand, I'll try to repeat it. Or you can come up to this microphone as well, if you'd like. So Margaret Mitchell, she's a unique lady. I'll tell you a little bit about her. So again, our subject is history and film. And so Gone with the Wind is, of course, about the Civil War. And specifically, it's about the Southern experience in and around Atlanta. Well, Margaret Mitchell grew up as a little girl. Her grandfather was in the Civil War. She grew up in Atlanta. She said that she spent her youth sitting on the lap of her grandfather and great aunts who told story after story after story. She'd say when she wrote Gone with the Wind, that came from her childhood stories. That, she created a fictional account, right? But it's a composite of lots of characters. She really, when she talked about how that came about, it's not much different than people like Willa Cather, who said, these were people I had met, and I changed them a bit. But I was influenced very much by that. She only wrote one novel in her life, although in the last 10 years, they have found a book or something that she had worked on earlier called, some of you guys may know the name of it. I think it's called like Lost Lazen or something like that. But they've now come up with a second book. But she basically spent 8 or 10 years of her life working on Gone with the Wind. And you can see she didn't live a super long life. I'm going to tell you my impressions of Margaret Mitchell. I hope I'm not making you mad or dashing any hopes. I think she was very intelligent. I think she was a great writer. I think she was a spoiled girl who became a spoiled woman. And that's not bad. But when you watch Gone with the Wind, I look at Scarlet and I'm thinking, oh yeah, that's you. Now that's just me. That's almost my personal assessment, that I can see the battles that she was in her own personal life a little bit in the Scarlet character. That may be true in lots of people, but especially when somebody writes one book, you're like, I think she's pouring out a lot of Margaret here. But it's a well-written book. The book was a bestseller, of course. Comes out in the late 30s. I mean, as soon as it came out, they wanted to make it into a screenplay, if you didn't know that. And the move was on. So this is what she says. Now, this is going back a little bit to what I said a second ago, in the sense that she says that, these stories came from her life. I had every detail clear in my mind before I sat down at the typewriter. Now, Atlanta was interesting, and by the 1930s, Atlanta was interesting because Atlanta had grown so much. In fact, she said the old neighborhoods where she once moved around were unsafe. She said that in the 30s. Some of that had to do with the Depression. Some of that had to do with just the population explosion kind of in Atlanta and the country in general. But there's no doubt that when she wrote Gone with the Wind, she was somewhat thinking, and bear with me, that I'm hearkening back to a better time. She wrote in some of her notes that to my grandparents and some others, those were beautiful times. So you get that feeling in the movie. Now, one of the criticisms of the movie today that I know you all know about is that the movie's not necessarily kind to African Americans. But you got to understand, Margaret Mitchell is literally, it is a reflection of her family and the people she heard from. And so you do get that. What I would give her much credit for is she does create characters that have depth. She really does. Think about it. I mean, there's no doubt that the character of Rhett Butler has a lot of depth. There's no doubt that Scarlet has a lot of depth. And even a lot of the secondary characters, they're deep. And the character that Hattie McDaniel plays, which we're going to talk about, Mammy, has a lot of depth. She really does. She is not, yeah, she is portrayed as the submissive, matron, but she's not portrayed, she's not walked over all the time. She's, you know what I mean? She's not just somebody's slave only. And you see that in the way she responds to Scarlet. You also see that in the way she responds to the other slaves from time to time. So there's some historical accuracy in that, ironically. Again, a fictional story based on historical accounts, but there's some interesting elements. So the first clip I do want to play is that very first clip, which I think it's titled Scarlet and Mammy. But I want you to see this interaction between these two women. So there's several more of those interactions between those two women, but Mammy stands up to her, and at the same time, you're so frustrated with Scarlett's kind of brazen, actions at times. Here's Mammy who's standing up to her, and sometimes she stands up to her by just being smart and kind of wisecracking her, and then, but also Mammy's character cares about Scarlett, and you're struck by that. She wants her to do well. She wants her to succeed. She wishes she was a better person, and so. Very strong character. And I'm going to talk about Hattie more in just a second. But I also will tell you, if you've never watched it before for fun, it's no joke, for fun, you should Google and look later today at all the women who tried out for the role of Scarlett O'Hara. And you may know this, right? But when you even watch it, you just can't imagine anybody else. I can't imagine anybody else than Vivien Leigh playing that role. It's just, like they say, sometimes certain people are made for a certain role. And it seems like that Vivien Leigh had that down. because some great actresses don't look comfortable all being Scarlet. And she may have grown into it a little bit. So here's the answer to the question on our sheet. So I'm going to try to give you a little bit of a, the details, the deep details on the film. Of course, we talked about before, it was expensive as all get out. It had to be funded by somebody who had a lot of money, and that somebody was David Selznick. Selznick put up most of the money. I mean, Selznick almost broke away from the studios. So I'm trying to not go on too many rabbit trails, but the studios were so huge in that era. Nowadays, anybody can make a movie. You might make a bad one, but you can make a movie. In those days, you couldn't do anything unless the studios backed you or you had a ton of money. And the two people everybody mentions had a ton of money, David Selznick and some guy named Howard Hughes. They could make stuff happen when nobody else could make stuff happen because they had so much money. And, of course, and Hughes had his moment trying to make films as well. Selznick's different than Hughes because Selznick's, in my opinion, he's a real filmmaker. He's a true, he's got a true mind. In fact, it's his brainchild, the whole thing. In the end, I think you can look sometimes and even see three people listed as director, but Victor Fleming should probably get the primary credit for that. George Cukor is important in casting, but he wasn't getting along with all the actors as easily as they wanted him to, and Fleming did. And so Fleming really kind of becomes the primary director. Usually they say that that's a rare thing. You don't want to have two or three people be a director or in that title because it's just too many egos clashing. Happens once in a while. But Fleming is really the director of note and the one to remember. And then, of course, here's the stars who you do know, I'm sure. Clark Gable, Vivian Leigh, Leslie Howard, the famous English actor who would die 3 years later in World War II. Olivia de Havilland, who just passed away. I'm sure you all know that, at 104. And then the famous Hattie Mcdaniel, and I'm going to talk about Hattie because Hattie's going to have several firsts. So I know this is a little of my personal interest, but Hattie Mcdaniel, you all know this, I'm sure, lived in Wichita. She lived in Wichita and she lived in Colorado, Denver. Her father was a pastor. Don't quote me on it, but she was one of 12 or 13 children. She truly was the child and grandchild of slaves. So, I mean, it's incredible. She made it in Hollywood, of course, playing the roles you just saw, playing a servant, playing a slave, playing a mammy. She had a great voice. She had great natural talent. She worked at her craft, but she had great natural talent. By the way, she did a lot on the radio, too, at times, because she did have that great voice. She could really nail it. I've heard people in film classes even saying they can tell when Hattie McDaniel's talking. I mean, even in the 30s, because her voice is unique. And, of course, again, a good actress. So if you haven't heard this before, Hattie does the film, and Hattie gets nominated for Best Supporting Actress. That's a wow. And then she wins. And that's a wow. Did you know that? So 1939, Hattie McDaniel, Best Supporting Actress. Hattie McDaniel, Best Supporting Actress, is not allowed to go to the ceremony or allowed to go to the premiere of the film in Atlanta because she's African American. The story goes Clark Gable made a phone call when he found that out and said, if she's not going, I'm not going. Then the story also goes that she called him and encouraged him to go no matter what. There were people who were her friends who encouraged her not to take those kind of roles anymore. They're like, you're better than this. Wait for the better ones, demand the better ones. You've got that kind of ability. She was very independent. She said, no, listen, I'll choose what I do. And she told many of her friends, I'm making good money. I'm doing well. So don't, mind your own business, stay in your own lane. If they offer me this role, I take this role. So she kind of thought for herself. Now, to me, the tragedy is that she does not live to an era where she would have gotten better roles and meatier roles and roles that weren't so much these kind of roles. I wish we'd have seen that because you can see her dates there. She doesn't live long enough to see that time come. 1952 is when she dies. Her dying wish was to be buried in the kind of Stars Cemetery, and I'm going to forget. I was there a couple of years ago, but Hollywood Forever. I think they denied her because she was black. They denied her even being buried in the Star Cemetery. She was buried in another cemetery. There was a move to move her body. I don't know if that happened. This part I can't remember. I haven't thought about it for a while. But there was a lot of injustice done to Hattie Mcdaniel in her lifetime for someone who was so talented. More should be said and done about her. One last thing about all that. You guys all know with the spirit of this year and the challenges of this year, Gone with the Wind has come up as a discussion to not be shown. I told you last week when we watched The Birth of a Nation, like no film is more appalling than Birth of a Nation to watch. It's pretty appalling, racially speaking. So I think HBO has pulled Gone with the Wind for now. Here's the latest, by the way. This is the newest. I almost played you a clip of Whoopi Goldberg and some others talking about this. The latest is that most people are calling for Gone with the Wind to be retained and shown, but to always have a little bit of a disclaimer at the beginning of the movie that we know this movie was made in 1939, blah, blah, blah. I actually like that. I like the idea that just saying something about it. I do not want the movie to go away. It's a great movie. It's a great, great movie. And I would like it to not go away. But I like the fact that there's a discussion because a discussion is great and it's worthy of it. And Whoopi Goldberg, among other people, if you haven't heard, she says if you pull movies like this, you got to pull a lot more movies. You got to pull every movie that's sexist. You got to pull every movie that shows women in bad. I mean, you're going to pull a lot of movies. You're never going to stop pulling movies. So, and I'm not a big, censor person, but so it's come up this year. But I hope it stays because, again, it's a great classic movie. Yeah.
People may know this, but local actress Carla Byrne.
Yeah.
A wonderful one-woman show
Of Hattie. So if you hadn't heard that, he just was saying that Carla Burns does a great one-woman stage show of Hattie, and they want to do more. I know there's attempts to do more too. So yeah, she does a great job. Yeah. She just was saying that Clark. It's been rumored that, or told that Clark Gable and was quite good friends with Hattie McDaniel. That they went to each other's houses, and that Clark really kind of espoused or pushed for her to win the Academy Award in 1939. Yeah, I think that's possible. I know he was very supportive. At least in one of the accounts I've read, he was probably the most supportive member of the cast regarding her treatment and her in general. I read one time that Vivien Leigh, I don't think the major parts of the cast were against her. I've read a couple things that Vivien Leigh was sort of quiet and not cool to her, but sort of standoffish. But I've also read that Vivien Leigh was standoffish to almost everybody. So I think that's accurate. I don't think it was because she was African American. I think it was because that was Vivien Leigh's personality. And Vivien Leigh was known to be kind of which I totally get. Vivien Leigh was kind of a person who, when she got on set, it's think time, it's brain time, it's focus time, leave me alone time. She was married to Laurence Olivier, at least at that time. So anyway, but yeah, Gable, kudos to Gable either way, I believe. Any other questions about Gone with the Wind? Yeah. I don't. I researched her one time years ago, and I've forgotten now. I think they went from here to Denver. I feel like that was the story, but I don't know where she lived. We could find that out on a census. So Orson Welles. I already kind of gave a prelim to Orson Welles. You can see when he was born, 1915. Of course, Orson Welles by the way, sorry, there's so much I could tell you here. I did not know this. If I knew this, I forgot this, which is very possible. Did you know that Orson Welles' great-grandfather was Gideon Welles, the Secretary of the Navy under President Lincoln? Orson Welles was very connected. If I'd heard that, I'd forgotten it. I thought that was incredible. I just didn't realize that. So his family was a pretty prominent family. in the upper Midwest, Wisconsin, Michigan area. Lots of people hear Orson Welles speak and they think he's either a stuck-up guy or English or something, because he has a very proper dialect. He had, great command of the language and whatever. He was definitely a genius. Also a guy who had a hard time staying in school. He could not focus. Like a lot of creative people, he said he just could not hardly focus in school because his mind was all over the place. You may know that he came to fame in the 1930s as a radio commentator, and that he gave the famous War of the Worlds radio broadcast that scared the heck out of everybody that the aliens were coming. And that's where he came to fame. But in the late 1930s, he convinced folks of a couple of stories that he wanted to tell on film. He was able to give the studio people the storyline, what we now call the treatment and what have you. And it led to him getting creative control over his project called Citizen Kane. Again, when this all began, he was 24, 25 years old. It's going to be 1941 or so before the film is out and out. And again, kind of in that window between the Depression and World War II. But I have quite a little bit to say about this one. This film has been considered by many to be the greatest film ever made. Not so much you guys, but I would say that most of the time when I talk to people, it's very rare that anybody's even seen the movie. I'm being honest. The last time I talked about Citizen Kane a year or so ago, I asked a room, and it was a room of variety of people and younger people too. And I don't know, a couple people in the building had seen Citizen Kane. And if you think about it, even when you watch TCM or what, you just don't see it very often. I guess I should ask you, how many of y'all have seen it? Don't be bashful. I'm just curious. Have you seen the movie? It's one of those movies you should see once, for sure. Well, it's innovative on several levels. And he did not necessarily go for a bunch of stars. A lot of people said, if you're going to do this, you got to land the stars, He didn't want to do that. He also knew he was going to spend a lot of money doing it. And he is the lead. It's almost as big a story that he's the lead as it is that he was able to get the kind of money and control to make the movie. I should tell you this. Back in those days, somebody who would direct a movie and then step aside while it went into editing. They wouldn't get in the editing bay. I know a tiny bit about film compared to any of these guys, and I've been in the editing bay for all the projects I've been around. But it is a weird thing, because if you're there at inception, I told you last week, I wrote a commissioned script. It will be an interesting thing to see yourself go from conception to conclusion where you're completely involved. In those days, that never happened, almost never happened. They might bring the director in for a rough cut, and then he might be able to critique it a bit. Orson Welles wanted to be there all the time. He's like, this is my baby, and I'm going to have my handles on it all the time. So here's, in your sheet, the little sheet I gave you, here are some of the innovations of Citizen Kane and Orson Welles, what they call deep focus. And I'll try to explain this. We try not to be too technical. So they have what you call racking focus on a camera. And so, for example, if I'm looking in the front row right now at you guys, and you're my picture, you're my image, I'm going to rack focus right here on the front row on Tat. And then the behind him, it's going to be out of focus a bit. I do that because I want him to be the subject of my shot. If I reverse that and I said I want the subject of my shot to be Ralph at the back of the room, I'd put Ralph in focus even if I did a long shot. Orson Welles wanted to layer people and have them all in focus. I can't remember now if one of the clips we see will actually show this, but there's a scene where Agnes Morehead is in the foreground. 10 feet back or so is the guy that's playing her husband. I don't recall who that is. He's in focus. And then out the window, we're still seeing action. So action, 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 and at least a bunch of it still all in focus. Meaning if the guy reacts, if the actor 10 feet reacts to what she said in the foreground, you'll see his reaction. Welles was big on this, and you'll see about 10 times in the movie, like if we actually cut it up, you'd see about 10 times in the movie where you can see focus, 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 reaction, reaction, reaction. You could react to all of them. people didn't think that was a good idea because they said it'll take away from your lead. It'll take away from the person that's delivering the line. He also used from Stagecoach, but I'm not saying it's all Stagecoach. He used low to high angles a lot. He got on the ground. For when he filmed the boy as a child, he got below him. He did that so he could show, everything from who was important to who was in charge to who shouldn't be in charge, all those kind of things. And then he moved differently. So in other words, he was a couple times in the film, he actually speeds up the shots, which was very difficult to do in those days, or he slowed it way down. He even kind of did a little bit of slow motion. So people who were film people in 1941, when they watched Citizen Kane, there were people who went in the room that were technical, who couldn't even pay attention to the storyline because they were so busy going, what's he doing? What's happening? They were just blown away by that. We've had a couple of recent films that have done things like this. The movie 1917 is filmed in almost one complete continuous shot, and it's just like revolutionary. So it's still happening a little bit. So here's Orson Welles as a director. He's got a big coffee cup. And this is the shot. Actually, I forgot I did include the photo. This is the shot I was telling you about. So here we have Agnes Morehead in the foreground. If you're older, Agnes Morehead was, what was she? Esmeralda on the show Bewitched. What is it? Yeah. The Samantha's mother, right? She's a great actress. But anyway, this is her in the foreground. Then the lawyer. Then her husband, who is a secondary character here. And then the son is outside. They're talking about the son. You notice how all of them are in focus. And that's an aperture adjustment that he's working on. That's definitely a close-up of someone's lips. If you watch the movie, there's this mysterious last words of Citizen Kane, where he said Rosebud, and they're all wondering what's Rosebud. I got to tell you, I don't know if it's a funny story. I got to tell you a story. When I was 16 years old, I was working at Dillon's, and all the guys, we had a guy that came in. It's not, young people can be cruel. But there was an older guy that came in that probably was homeless, and God bless him. But he must have looked like this character, and some older guys at the store kept calling him Rosebud. And I just remember them all referring to him as Rosebud. 20 years later, I'm watching Citizen Kane. I'm like, oh, that's why they called him Rosebud. He looked like this guy from the movie. But this mysterious word, which I won't ruin it for you because I want you to watch it if you haven't seen the movie. The big question is, who did Orson Welles base this account on? And it'll probably be when we get back from break maybe, but we're going to watch a couple of his responses. And the question everybody had is, did you base the story of Citizen Kane on the newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst? Well, I'm a historian, so I'm going to tell you what I think. And then when we get back from break, we're going to listen to what Orson Welles said. Citizen Kane literally directly quotes William Randolph Hearst 5 or 6 times. This is one of the quotes. By the way, this quote's even debated. Some people say Hearst didn't say it exactly like this, but it's been for 100 years, people have said that when the Spanish-American War was coming, that Hearst, who wanted us to go to war with Spain because he was tired of Spanish incursions in the Americas, that Hearst said many times, you furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war. He had so much control over newspapers across the United States. He was a tycoon, and he had so much control over newspapers across the United States that he had a lot of power. And again, if you don't know the story, when the explosion happened in Havana Harbor, the next day, William Randolph Hearst and others, Joseph Pulitzer and others, were famous for saying, and one of the headlines said, let me think of the whole quote here. Of course, the headline says war, and then it says, remember the Maine, which was the name of the ship that was exploded. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. War. Well, when you own the media outlets And boy, in those days, newspapers were the media outlets, right? You own the newspapers, you own the media outlets, you can have a lot of public opinion. So people saw that headline and they were ready to go to war. I don't know if Hearst was or wasn't 100% the guy, but look, you see what the next line is on that slide? Hearst, when he heard about the movie, and before he even saw the movie, he tried to have the movie banned. By the way, the story is Orson Welles only saw that movie one time himself. Orson Welles did not like to see himself on camera, and that, which is fascinating too. He must have seen it in an editing room, but once it was out, he kind of walked away from it. So anyway, Hearst tried to have the movie banned. It was banned in many countries. It was banned in Russia. It was banned in a lot of places. So the movie had a lot of impact, a lot of social impact for sure. Let me go ahead and do this slide, and then we'll take our break. And when we come back, like I said, I want to show a clip, the main clip from Citizen Kane. Orson Welles argued that Kane was a composite character, and that this is his answer, by the way, to the question, who is it based on? You're basing this on history, obviously. You're basing this on monopolies, or people who can monopolize an industry, obviously. And we've got these handful of tycoons that nobody really likes. So who are you talking about? He said it was based on these four characters: William Randolph Hearst, Harold McCormick, Samuel Insull, and Howard Hughes. And Howard Hughes is interesting just because at that point, Howard Hughes is pretty young. You know, Hearst has been around a while at this point. He's 70 years old, or almost 70 years old. But it's surprising that he might have tagged into Howard Hughes. Here's the director, Orson Welles. Here's the cinematographer. A lot of people say that Greg Toland deserves as much acclaim and credit for what happened in this movie as anybody. By the way, he was a cinematographer on 3 of these movies. Of the big list, he's a cinematographer on 3 of them. So he was a big deal. He was definitely the innovator. I mean, as much as Welles was, and I think it was Welles's story, Welles's ideas, Welles's push. Toland was super important. And then the stars were simply Orson Welles and Joseph Cotten. Orson Welles went from a pretty well-known radio voice. Within the next 5 years, Orson Welles was one of the most well-known people in the world. Here's how well-known he was. He got to marry Rita Hayworth. He met Adolf Hitler, Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman. They all knew him well. Before he was 30, he was the phenom in the room. He says, I don't know if it's any of the clips. I'm sorry, the clips come together in my head. He said at one point he was in a hotel, and I forget where, in Europe or somewhere, and he was with someone he was trying to sell a script to. And it was not an American. And he said, we were sitting down at a table, and Winston Churchill walked in. The story was right after World War II, because Churchill, lost re-election, amazingly, after the war. And Churchill walked in the room, and Orson Welles is over there eating with this guy that he's trying to say, hey, I need $5 million to make this movie. And Churchill walked in the room, and when Churchill walked in the room, he saw Welles, and he bowed, or he tipped his hat. And the guy that's eating lunch with Welles goes, Winston Churchill? Like, you know him? And Orson Welles, yeah, we met. Yeah, we're friends. The guy, and so the next day, I'll go ahead and tell you the story. The next day, they're at the same hotel. Welles is in the pool, and Churchill walks out. And Welles has been given the money by this guy who he's trying to get money from. And Churchill walks out, and Welles goes, Mr. Churchill, I have to tell you, you can't believe what you did for me yesterday. And Churchill walks over and he says, tell me about it. And he said, well, I was here with a financier that I was praying would give me money to make my next movie. And he said, when he saw you tip your hat, he wrote the check. And Churchill said, well, by all means, if you did that, let me do a better job. And he completely bowed to Orson Welles. And Welles said, yeah, that's a pretty great moment. Winston Churchill bowed to me. Churchill was making fun of it. He goes, I would have given him a full bow if I could have got you more money. Okay, we're going to take a break. Think about any questions you might have, and you can certainly email them or message them or bring them up to me or ask live when we get back. Okay, we're back. I just want to, if you guys, I do want you to ask questions. If you do, there is this microphone if you want to speak to where everybody can hear. Certainly feel free to do that. I'll do my best to repeat if you ask from where you are, but I love the questions because you can go so many different directions with some of the things we're talking about. So we're going to go to a clip here. We're going to listen to an interview with Orson Welles. So I told you that I was an Orson Welles fan, and you can, if you start listening to Orson Welles, they'll never end. He was interviewed a lot in the 60s, 70s, and in the 80s. You guys may, I'm sure you remember that. That was the kind of older, bearded, heavier Orson Welles, and he came on all the talk shows, Dick Cavett and all of them, to talk about all kinds of things, and he was always super interesting. I also wanted to tell you that these links will be available, and if you want some of these links, because we're skipping over a few of them, but if you want any of the links, they're just clips, but there's certain clips that I think are interesting. This one's an interview. This is the first one that's an interview. We won't watch it all, but I wanted to watch 4 or 5 minutes of it. But anyway, you can get them from us, so just let us know or send us an email if you want to see any of those. So this is Orson Welles being interviewed about Citizen Kane. He seemed a bit reticent to talk about it, especially later, I think he felt a little attacked, or he felt like everybody was going to think that he was out to get somebody, and I don't think he wanted that to be the point. He didn't want that to be the point. So this is an interview with him, I think about 1959 or 1960.
Is it true that when Citizen Kane was being made, that people actually tried to stop it being made? And is it true that Randolph Hearst, the newspaper tycoon, took it as being an attack on himself and tried to stop it when it was made being shown?
To the first part of your question, there was indeed a very definite effort to stop the film during shooting by those elements in the studio who were attempting to seize power, because in those days, studio politics, particularly RKO and indeed many of the big studios in Hollywood, were very much like Central American republics. And there were revolutions and counter-revolutions and every sort of palace intrigue. And there was a big effort to overthrow the then head of the studio, who was taken to be out of his mind because he'd given me this contract, which made the making of these films possible. And stopping me or proving my incompetence would have won their case. Mr. Hearst was quite a bit like Kane, although Kane isn't really founded on Hearst in particular. There are many people sat for it, so to speak. But he was like Kane in that he wouldn't have stooped to such a thing. But he had many hatchet men, editors and representatives of this great network of newspapers all over the country. And to get in good with the chief, there was a good deal of very strong hatchet, including an effort to frame me on a criminal charge, which a policeman was good enough to tell me about. It's sensational and silly and dangerous and gangsterish as that.
Was Mr. Hearst's staff absolutely wrong? I mean, when you say that it was based on that kind of man, was he really stronger in your mind than just being that kind of man?
Well, let me ask you if you think he was libeled.
Well, I don't know him.
I see, yes. Well, do you think that the figure of Kane himself is a deeply unsympathetic figure? In the Soviet Union, for example, the film has been forbidden general distribution because this important capitalist and newspaper tycoon and anti-social and crypto-fascist figure, etc., to quote all the slogans, is too sympathetic. And for that reason, it's not shown, never has been.
When you read about Citizen Kane, a lot of the things you read suggest that it was a very big social document, a massive attack on big American institutions of the day. Now, I've always seen it rather as a story, to be honest. Naturally, any story has got its implications, but I've seen it as a story. I'd like to know what your intentions were. Did you mean it as a social document or as a story?
I must confess I must answer this in a way that I loathe. I must admit that it was intended consciously as a sort of social document, as an attack on the acquisitive society, and indeed on acquisition in general. But I didn't think that up and then try to find a story to match the idea. Of course, I think the storyteller's first duty is always to the story.
It makes it all the more ironic, doesn't it, that it should have been stopped in the Soviet Union?
Yes, but of course it wasn't at all a communist picture or a Marxist picture. It was an attack on property and acquisition of property and
the corruption.
Yes, and of the acquisitive society of a man who, of real gifts and real charm and real humanity, who destroys himself and everything near him because, tired old words, mammon and all that really was,
Now, when you made this film, you were only 25, weren't you? I mean, everybody knows that you had the most astonishing contract that Hollywood has ever provided.
Yes.
Ever.
Not financially speaking, in terms of authority and
Yes.
rights. Financially, it wasn't extraordinary in any way at all. It was extraordinary in the control it gave me over my own material.
You had total control.
Total control, so much so that the rushes, which I perhaps should explain that are the pieces of film that are shown at the end of the day's work, as I'm sure you understand, and are always checked by everybody in the studio, department heads and the bankers and distributors and everything, long before there's a rough cut. But according to the terms of my contract, the rushes couldn't be seen by anyone. And indeed, the film couldn't be seen until it was ready for release. I got that good a contract because I didn't really want to make a film.
Well, you better develop that.
And when you don't really want to go out to Hollywood, or at least this was true in the old days, or the golden days of Hollywood, when you honestly didn't want to go, then the deals got better and better. In my case, I didn't want money. I wanted authority. So I asked the impossible, hoping to be left alone. And at the end of a year's negotiations, I got it.
Yes.
Simply because there was no real vocation there. My love for films began only when we started work.
What I'd like to know is, where did you get the confidence from to make a film with such...
Ignorance, sheer ignorance. There's no confidence to equal it. It's only when you know something about a profession, I think, that you're timid or careful.
How does ignorance show itself?
I thought you could do anything with a camera that the eye could do or the imagination could do. And if you come up from the bottom in the film business, you're taught all the things that the cameraman doesn't want to attempt for fear he will be criticized for having failed.
Yes.
And in this case, I had a cameraman who didn't care if he was criticized if he failed. And I didn't know that there were things you couldn't do. So anything I could think up in my dreams, I attempted to photograph.
Isn't that incredible? Several things about that I just think are great. That's why I wanted to show that particular interview, because he says it was a social document against the acquisitive nature, the acquiring of stuff in the American mindset.
20 days work. Oh.
Yet he said it's also very kind of capitalistic in many ways at the same time. And then I loved what he said there at the end. I just wanted to get us through that, where he said, I didn't know what I didn't know, and I thought anything I could imagine I could show. And I think that's so. It seems very simple, but it's very cool. It's extremely cool, because he's saying, and it's true in everything, right? You get told when you go into teacher training. I'm teaching an education class this fall, along with my history classes. I'm doing a methods class. And, you go into those kind of trainings and they say, don't do this and don't do that. And that makes sense. I mean, those are things we've learned, but he was thinking completely out of the box, and he was too young to know any better. And it's a funny thing. So anyway, that all just adds to my understanding of him being who he was and being so unique. And of course, he hit the timing right. He had the ideas right. But you do see there that he does answer the question, and he said it is a bit of a social document. I wanted to make people think, and he did. And I love that the film was controversial and whatever. So anyway, if you haven't seen it, I would encourage you to see it. So that's our second film. Anyway, you got several innovations there, on our little list. You got several innovations in that film that we just heard. Probably the most innovations up until that time. So then the third film we're going to talk about is The Grapes of Wrath. I kind of went back and forth on this one, but if you haven't seen it, you should see it. Let me start by telling you, Henry Fonda is amazing. Another amazing actor. And I love Henry Fonda in the 30s and the 40s. I mean, I love Jimmy Stewart. They both talk about presence on film. I'm sure you know that Henry Fonda grew up in Omaha, Nebraska. And so he had that to pull on, and there's actually been essays written about some of these famous actors and famous talents, like an Orson Welles, a Henry Fonda, a Jimmy Stewart, a John Wayne. it is weird that they all did not come from anywhere near California. Henry Fonda from Omaha, John Wayne grew up in Iowa. Jimmy Stewart grew up at in Pennsylvania. His dad ran a hardware store. Orson Welles in Wisconsin. It's kind of interesting. I think what that does show you is those people probably had a feeling of regular people somewhat. They understood, another world. And of course, Hollywood was different in those days too. It was much smaller. Fonda is one of those guys, in my opinion. I'm sure you all know him well, but I think if you don't want to watch him from the 30s to the 50s is when I love him the most, maybe. Fonda is one of those guys. We talked earlier about John Wayne's presence. Fonda's face. There's something about his face and the expressions in his face and him conveying so much. If you watch The Grapes of Wrath, fear, anger, all these things, you can see him without him saying a word. And he's so good at it. Well, I told you earlier that sometimes I've played these films for younger students, and it's sort of my test. I'm going to be honest with you. A lot of students don't like Grapes of Wrath. Now, I love it, and I think it's great. And I love Steinbeck, and I think he's great. I love Of Mice and Men, and a lot of people don't. I don't think the students don't like the movie because they like it, but I think they don't like the movie and some of Steinbeck's work because some of Steinbeck's work is uncomfortable. That's my opinion. It feels uncomfortable. People that poor, people that distraught. If you've ever read or seen Of Mice and Men, maybe I should ask you, have you seen Of Mice and Men or read that book? It gut checks you, You think to yourself, could we ever be faced with these kind of decisions? But Steinbeck, while he doesn't write very many quote unquote direct history books, but he's constantly looking at life. Again, if we talked about Steinbeck for a while, Cannery Row is just an absolute microscope of, fishermen and people living on Cannery Row. Of Mice and Men is an absolute focused view of two men, George and Lenny. And Grapes of Wrath is focused on the Joad family. And one of the reasons I also selected Grapes of Wrath for you all in this group was because to me, it conveys the Depression about as good as any movie, especially that came out in that era. It also hits home with us here in the Midwest. And I absolutely, as much as I brag on Henry, and I would keep bragging on Henry Fonda, I absolutely love Jane Darwell as Ma Joad. She's incredible. And she did win an Academy Award. But I think she gets overlooked too. I'm not trying to make a politically correct statement when I tell you this. Actresses got overlooked a lot in this era. They'd win their awards, and you remember the Vivian Lees, and you do, but you forget people like Jane Darwell, who was, again, go back and watch that movie, and we're going to watch a clip. I hope I don't ruin the story in case you haven't watched it. So let me tell you a little bit of backstory on the movie. So it was, of course, influenced by the Great Depression, but it was influenced primarily by the migration of the people from the Midwest to California. If any of us have studied our ancestry or whatever in our families were in this region, we almost always had an uncle, an aunt, a nephew, a niece, a cousin, or somebody who went to California who said, I can't do it. I can't stand. I teach a lot. Of course, I do Kansas history in college. And when I talk about the Dust Bowl, I always talk about all the clubs and stuff that they formed, the Last Man's Club, where everybody in the county would sign a document that says, I won't go, I won't move, I'll be the last man in this county. And how hard they fought to stay. And certainly my grandparents were in that group. My parents were born in Oklahoma, both my parents, and my grandparents both had land in Oklahoma. I still own a farm in Oklahoma. And so this story hits home with me in that respect because I feel like I see my grandparents in some of these characters. There was a Depression-era diarist named Ernest Svoboda. That's hard to pronounce even when I don't have a mask on. S-V-O-B-O-D-A, Svoboda. And he kept track of the Depression kind of through his diary. And, he writes in it every day, I'm not moving. He lived in Meade County, Kansas. I'm not moving. I don't care if hell freezes over. I'm not moving. I'm not moving. I'm not moving. He starts this in 1933. Well, you all know that in some places in Oklahoma, it doesn't rain for five years. It rains 5 times in a handful of years. In 1935 was terrible. Well, this Ernest Svoboda, he's writing this, and you can tell as the years progress, he's waning. He's starving. His family's starving. And people in those days had an incredible responsibility to feed their families, of course. And anyway, he finally gives up. 1938, he says, I can't do it. I got to go to California. And you all know they're constantly advertising there's jobs in California. And as the story goes, for every one job that's advertised, 100 people come. And so it doesn't work, right? There's too many people for the jobs that are there as orange pickers or whatever else. Well, anyway, Ernest Svoboda says in one of his last entrants, he said the only difference between the Sahara and Kansas is that no damn fools are trying to farm the Sahara. Kansas is a desert. The dust is just eating them alive. They're dying. And so this is what gets the Okies and the Arkies, as some people used to call them, out. They got them out. They got them to go west. And like I said, we've all had family members. I actually put this picture in. This is my family. So this is our family farm. And my grandpa and my great uncle are in that picture. Yeah, we all have pictures like that. Many of us do, from the 30s. John Steinbeck saw that migration of Okies and Arkies coming to his home, California. He lived in California. And he saw that, and he was impressed by them, and he listened to them. And it's his listening to their stories that is Grapes of Wrath. It is of Mice and Men. It affected the Grapes of Wrath the most. Grapes of Wrath is the main one. So these are some of Steinbeck's more famous works. The title for the book, and I'm going to forget the exact passage, but the title comes from Revelation. Story goes that his wife actually told him the title. He'd written the book or was writing the book and was telling his wife about it. And hey, this is how it's going to go down. This is how it happens, whatever. And she walked in one day and she quoted a verse from Revelation. And he said, that's it. And the Grapes of Wrath stuck. Steinbeck would go on to write, of course, into the 60s. And one of our greatest American novelists. But this is the part I want to tell you. It's connected to the movie too. His writings were very authentic. They were very real. They were very serious. There was no happy ending. People want happy endings, and I'm for happy endings too. But sometimes it's not there. It doesn't happen that way. And he didn't have happy endings. I mean, if you read Of Mice and Men, if you've read that, you know what I'm talking about. Right? It's not always a happy ending. And he would also curse. His characters might curse. Some of his books, they wanted to pull a lot of his books because there was so much bad language in it at times. And we'd look at it now and we'd be like, well, that's not that bad. That's not much at all. But in those days, they didn't like that. And so now some of that language did not make it into the movie. But anyway, so The Grapes of Wrath comes out, and it is a star-studded cast. And this is the storyline. The family that is upended is the Jode family. Pa and Ma Jode. Grandpa goes along. Grandpa Jode, by the way, is Charlie Grapewind, who plays Uncle Henry in The Wizard of Oz. He had a couple big movies in about a year. He was in The Wizard of Oz and he was in Grapes of Wrath, which is pretty incredible. Anyway, the story positions the difficult decisions that are made by the poor and downtrodden in society, which include things like, do you steal? I mean, how much do you have to be? Where do you have to be? How many people have to be starving in your family before you steal? They're wrestling with that. Like, do we take stuff that's not ours? How far do we go? Where do we go? Who's responsible? The grandfather is kind of one character that's kind of struggling, and he's already past his time. He can't do anything, but he doesn't want to go to California. The grandparents don't want to go. The father's lost control. Father's worked himself to death. He's sick. He can't hardly function. I told you the story. I'm being kind of transparent here. I told you the story really hits home with me. It hits home with me because my mother's family, three people committed suicide in a short amount of time. They were struggling. They also had things wrong that people didn't understand, but they were struggling. They had no money. 6 months here, then 6 months there, then 6 months there. I mean, that's this family. They can't hold on. They can't own anything. No bank's going to give them a nickel. So this book and this movie really hits that home. And of course, the oldest brother is Henry Fonda's character, right? And so Henry Fonda is the one that he feels responsibility too, and he needs to try to help any way he can. And he's struggling between the responsibility of things and doing the right thing. And doing the right thing is a problem for him. And of course, Jane Darwell's character, she's a mother. And mothers are always amazing. And mothers always hold the family together when men don't know what to do. I mean, that's somewhat depicted, and it's a struggle. Not to berate men at all. Men are amazing. I mean, father figures are amazing, but this battle between what happens when things break down. So anyway, this is again for our little crib sheet that I gave you guys. It was directed by John Ford. I actually said stuff about Ford earlier, but I want to say that sometimes we do overlook Ford's ability. We almost think he just was out running around making Westerns, which I love Westerns, but he made a lot of other kinds of films. Here again, look who our cinematographer is, the great Greg Toland, the same guy that did Orson Welles. And then here are the stars, Henry Fonda, John Carradine, and Jane Darwell. And I mentioned to you that Jane Darwell will get the Academy Award. Jane Darwell continued in lots of movies after this, and before I forget, in 1963 or 64, is it Mary Poppins? I think it's Mary Poppins. She was still living, and Walt Disney wanted her to be in the movie. You guys may remember this. I'm bringing something out here from the memory bank. But I do know Walt Disney went to visit her because she was very retired, and she was old. And he begged her to be in this movie. And I think it's Mary Poppins. And so she's in the movie, but only because Disney begged her to do so. Like Citizen Kane, the film was a bit of a social document. You definitely could call it a social document on what's going to happen. How are we going to do this in a social commentary? And I know I've been pushing on this. Fonda we know about, and I love him. But it was unique to have a woman be the lead and be that significant. And that's an innovation too. A female lead, and not a female lead that's just a pretty face being a beautiful woman playing that game, but a female lead that's a mother over a beat-up family, a downtrodden family, a husband that's just worn out, all those things. So we're going to watch this clip from the movie. This is towards the end of the movie. This is the Grapes of Wrath clip.
20 days work. Oh, boy.
No, I'll be glad to get my hands on some cotton. That's the kind of picking I understand.
Maybe 20 days work and maybe no days work. We ain't got it till we get it.
What's the matter, Ma? Getting scared?
Scared? Huh. I ain't never gonna be scared no more. I was, though. For a while, it looked as though we was beat. Good and beat. Looked like we didn't have nobody in the whole wide world but enemies. Like nobody was friendly no more. Made me feel kind of bad and scared, too. Like we was lost and nobody cared.
You're the one that keeps us going, Ma. I ain't no good no more, and I know it. Seems like I spend all my time these days thinking how it used to be. Thinking of home. I ain't never gonna see it no more.
Well, Pa, a woman can change better than a man. A man lives sort of, well, in jerks. Baby's born or somebody dies, and that's a jerk. He gets a farm or loses it, and that's a jerk. With a woman, it's all in one flow like a stream. Little eddies and waterfalls, but the river, it goes right on. Woman looks at it that way.
Well, maybe. But we sure taking a beating.
I know. That's what makes us tough. Rich fellas come up and they die, and their kids ain't no good and they die out. But we keep a-coming. We're the people that live. They can't wipe us out. They can't lick us. We'll go on forever, Pa, 'cause we're the people.
It's a great scene. And I just in watching that scene, I mean, it's one shot, it's one angle pretty much. But you see how the father's face is almost like he's given up, or you can see it in his face. She's the leader. And but they're together, they're a team, and it's really neat story, neat film. So if you haven't seen The Grapes of Wrath, watch it. If you haven't read it, reread or even reread it. It's a great one. Our last film today is to talk about is Sergeant York. Whereas Grapes of Wrath is based on Citizen Kane was a social document on probably William Randolph Hearst. Gone with the Wind is, stories heard by Margaret Mitchell. Grapes of Wrath was stories collected by John Steinbeck of real people. But here we have an actual event, an actual story, an actual person. And so I want to talk a bit about this one. How many of you guys have seen this movie, Sergeant York? Again, one of those ones, if you haven't seen it, you should see it. You should hear about it. Gary Cooper is the lead. Another great actor. So here's the real guy, Alvin York. And we're going to see a cool clip here at the end of this one, too. More of an interview. So Alvin York grew up in Tennessee, the backwoods. He was a marksman. He was a hunter, kind of a low-income family. He was almost 30 years old when World War I came. And so he was no 18-year-old young kid. He had been a rough young man. He'd been a troublemaker. He'd been a challenge, to say the least. He converted and became a Christian 2 or 3 years before World War I came. And I won't go into the deep details on that. But the religion and the church that he went to were pacifist. And pretty openly pacifist. And of course, before World War I, you had never had the kind of push for everybody to serve like you had until World War I. Civil War was probably the only time up to that point in time where everybody went and did something almost. But World War I and World War II, we're going to have a draft, and we're going to have a lot of people involved pretty quickly. So 30-year-old Alvin York gets his draft notice. Remember, he just converted to Christianity a couple years before that. He just kind of started walking the walk of being a better guy, and his church taught pacifism. When York got his draft notice, he went to his pastor. His dad wasn't around either. He went to his pastor. He showed him what happened. And York applied for conscientious objector status. So in other words, he applied to not serve or to serve in a non-combatant role if he had to serve. Well, York was compelled to serve, so he had to go. And I could go through a longer version of that, but anyway, after a few months, he had to go. So he went, and he showed up. Well, in basic training, remember, he's 30 years old. He's more mature. He's better behaved. He's really good with a rifle. And so his major, Edward Buxton, says, I want to promote the young man. But of course, the conversation happens, and York says, listen, I'm not fighting. He's asking to not fight. He's like, put me somewhere else. Give me a support role. Give me a medical role. Give me something else, but I'm not going to fight. And so Buxton and him have several deep theological conversations. And the end of all that is, after it's over, Buxton convinces York to go ahead and let himself be rated as a military person. In other words, that he's going to be in a combat unit. York would say later on, one of his famous quotes in his Tennessee vernacular, he would say, before and after he talked to Buxton for a while, he said, I worried about it all the time. The good book told me I shouldn't kill. And he said, I worried and my thoughts just didn't stay hitched. So he really had, this is not a joke, he really had a difficult time thinking about it. I tell my students when I'm talking about Alvin York, a good person would have this kind of conflict of conscience, even if he decides to do it. He'd be thinking about it, and he was thinking about it. So anyway, he gets into a combat unit, and the way World War I worked, our troops, really, the main part of their fighting was about 6 months during 1918. That's exactly when York went over. He went over in the summer of 1918. He was thrown into the Meuse-Argonne sector, which is the toughest fighting of the war. World War I groups or World War I soldiers fought in, I'm sure you all know about trench warfare. They were fought in 16-man units. They had a sergeant, a corporal, and then 14 privates, sometimes 2 corporals and 13 privates. York was a corporal. So he had no military training before that, 6 months before this, but he was, like I said, a mature guy, good guy, with a kind of sketchy background, but a great guy. And so September 1918, Alvin York is in a bad spot And his 16-man unit is in one of those trenches. And the problem with trenches is you get one area to gets run over, and suddenly you can get really cut off. Trench warfare plays with your mind. Remember, chemical warfare is new here. Like I said, plays with your head. Well, York's sergeant is killed. 4 or 5 members of the privates are killed. So York is now the only corporal with 6 or 7 privates. And he is in a bad spot. Now they're looking down a trench. I won't go through the combat part of this, but if you haven't heard the whole story, York was good with a gun. So York does everything he can to see if he can fight his way out of it. Somehow he shot and killed 25 Germans. He then saw the German captain or lieutenant, and basically what he's doing is he's getting an angle on him that they can't see him, and he's using his marksmanship, but he puts a pistol to the German lieutenant's head and says, surrender all your men. So of course the lieutenant, not wanting to die, surrendered 125 men. So York and 6 Americans marched back 125 Germans to his lines. When York showed up with the men, they didn't even know what was going on. They didn't know why 125 Germans were walking up to American lines. They thought they were just willingly surrendering. And then they realized York had his pistol on the guy's temple. Well, York became at that point, the highest decorated American private soldier. In fact, he was the highest decorated until World War II. I think Audie Murphy eclipsed him. But York became a national hero, a conscientious objector who now was the greatest military hero in America. He was extremely uncomfortable with all this. In fact, I'll tell you this story, and it's, again, no joke. The day after he did what I told you, he killed 25 and killed 25 to 30 and captured 125 German soldiers. The day after that, his fellow soldiers said that York was on that battlefield on his hands and knees praying. And he also, his kids said he never was comfortable being a hero for it. And he was also always asking his family members, did I do the right thing? His son was a Baptist minister. In fact, when York was dying on his deathbed, he said, boy, tell me I did the right thing. So it was definitely a conflict of conscience for him his whole life. But a wonderful guy. Well, of course, it's a great American story. And York was a good guy. So this was made into a screenplay in the 1930s. They selected Gary Cooper to play it. I read one of the commentaries I read recently about the movie said, this guy, sometimes I struggle with people who write commentaries. I'm not saying I know anything, but I teach U.S. history. And sometimes these people who write commentaries don't know any U.S. history. And that's fine, but you know what I mean? They're writing out of context. And one of the things the guy says, this reviewer, who I don't know who he is, but he said basically, I wish there would have been some more advice given on set to this and that and the other. And I'm like, well, Alvin York was on set. The guy's story, wouldn't that be the best counsel you could get? He was there. He saw it all. Now, what the filmmakers might have done, I don't know. But I certainly wouldn't criticize the person who had the experience. You know what I mean? That guy had an incredible experience. So anyway, Howard Hawks, who was a great director, later on directed, I think it's Red River and several other good movies. He was the director. Gary Cooper, Walter Brennan. I love Walter Brennan. Who doesn't love Walter Brennan? Walter Brennan's like worth a talk himself. So unique elements was that you have the actual participant. You actually have the guy that it all happened to standing there. And then I think it's got a lot of similarities to All Quiet on the Western Front because you can see the conflict of conscience that's going on throughout the story. And I love that. And I love that that's brought about. Of course, it's a patriotic movie, and it happens to come out right as we are entering World War II, which was just timing that was involved there. I want to tell you one funny story before we watch this interview. And that is, I said Alvin York was there to advise. Alvin York was a great guy, definitely a humble farmer type. His number one interest after the war was education. He felt like a lot of people in the backwoods did not get educated very well. So he put a lot of his money into education, or a lot of his effort into education. Anyway, and maybe this is in this clip, but I've read this several times. Gary Cooper was a great guy, but Gary Cooper was a smoker. And Alvin York never smoked and didn't smoke during World War I. And so Alvin York got after Gary Cooper on set several times for lighting up. Told him to cut it out. We even went to the director and said, if he won't quit smoking, you need to get rid of him. He was doing that partly because he knew Cooper was embodying him, and he wanted him to act like him. And so that was part of who he was. Plus, this is another important part to that. York had turned a corner before World War I. He had been an alcoholic. He had been a lot of things, and so he was wanting Cooper to show an innocence of kind of a new life, new view of things. And so he really wanted Cooper to do that. So you can see Cooper in the movie being pretty humble, pretty backwards, because York was. Okay, so we're going to watch this clip. This is super cool because get this: 2 of Alvin York's sons are still living. 2 of Alvin York's children are still living, a son and a daughter. He had several kids. I won't ruin that for you. But you guys know about the World War I Museum in Kansas City. The children have gone 2 or 3 times and spoken up there, which is really cool. And again, it's a unique perspective. So let's watch this, and then we'll say a few more words.
What an honor it is for me to help christen this absolutely beautiful new venue and help share the inspirational story of Sergeant Alvin C. York with all of you, whether you're seeing the movie for the first time or the 21st time. And what's really great for me and for all of us here is that we have 2 of Sergeant York's family members here with us tonight to talk about him and help us introduce this film. So let me bring them up right now. First of all, we have one of Sergeant York's grandsons, a retired U.S. Army colonel who over 31 years of active service served our country in Vietnam, Korea, Fort Bragg in North Carolina, and as I just learned, here in Southern California at Fort MacArthur. And he is now the chairman of the Sergeant York Patriotic Foundation. So please help me welcome Gerald York. But first, coming up the stairs, hold on, who I also want to introduce, and I'll take your hand if you'd like me to. Looks like here, let's move this out of the way. Sure. And this gentleman that I have the honor to be.
I have a knee put in.
You had a knee put in?
And another one I've got to put in.
There you go.
Yeah.
Now this is Mr. Andrew Jackson York. This is Sergeant York's son. And this gentleman spent 43 years as a Tennessee State Park Ranger at the Sergeant York Historical Site. And you are now on the board of directors of the Sergeant York Patriotic Foundation. So great to have you here. So Andrew Jackson York and Gerald York. Here's a chair for you. What a thrill to have both of you here. So uncle and nephew, if you're going to put it all together. Okay. So you two are going to be sitting through the film, which I think is great. How cool that you guys get to watch Sergeant York with Sergeant York's son and grandson. Okay, that's just crazy. When's the last time you saw this movie, Gerald?
The last time was in New York on York Avenue that was named after my grandfather last October.
Okay. And then pass the mic over to your uncle. When's the last time you saw this movie?
The last time I've seen it, it's only been about a year ago, a year and a half ago or something. Yeah.
It's great. How do you, as a family, introduce this movie to new generations of Yorks? So is it like if someone turns 10, is it like, it's now your time to watch Sergeant York? How do you guys do it?
Well, with my kids and now grandkids, I tell them they have to watch the movie. Sometimes it's a little hard for them to understand the language because it is older English.
I ain't a Karen.
I ain't a Karen.
How be you knowing?
Trouble is especially some of the grandchildren, my grandchildren kind of pick up those words, which don't do them any good in school.
That's true. Has it been fun for you to introduce this movie to new generations of your family over the decades?
Yeah, of course, I worked for a state park, like he said, 43 years as a ranger. and I met thousands and thousands of people.
Oh.
And they always asked me questions about the movie, how was this and how was that. And I told them, I said, Daddy stayed down and went to Hollywood and stayed there most of the time when the movie was making. He'd come home and then he would go back. And then he went back one time and he cut the whole section out, stopped the movie because they caught Gary Cooper smoking. So we got a picture of Gary Cooper at the park, him apologizing to Daddy for smoking. So now that kind of shows you how strict he was in the movie. He didn't want anything put in there that wasn't right.
Right.
And there's one section they asked me about, and I really don't know, and that's lightning. I told him, I said, do you remember when the Pastor Pyle was talking to Dad? And he was like Gary Cooper, trying to get him to change his ways. And he said, well, the pastor told him, said, York, maybe the Lord will come like a bolt of lightning. And that'd be the only reason that he'd let that lightning come in there if it wasn't true.
Mm.
But now Pastor Pyle, he lives joining farms to where we live. And I've never known of anybody yet that took their pastor and their mother on the honeymoon. Y'all might know, but I don't know anybody. I told him, Daddy must be a really good friend, him and Pastor Pyle. See, the governor came all the way from Nashville and up on the side of the mountain on Daddy's piece of land there and married him. Then they went back to Nashville. The governor took Daddy and Pastor Pyle and his mother too. I never did ask him. I've been named to ask him, but I never did. Never could think of it. But I don't know of anyone else that done that.
Right.
My father had 10 kids. I'm number 5 out of 10 kids. And me and my sister is the only living Medal of Honor winner of World War I.
Wow.
With only 2 living kids.
Wow.
So they gave us a nice plaque down at the legislature in Nashville. So it's just one thing after another. And I mean, it's something going on all the time somewhere. And they're calling you to come here and come there. But anyway, I'll let you talk to my nephew here.
Listen, I can listen to you for hours.
So that's a clip. If you want to watch more of it, we can give you access to that. And that comes from obviously a recent film festival, TCM, Turner Classic Movies Film Festival. But you see how unique that movie is in the sense, again, unique. You actually have the person who it happened to on set. You're still to 2020. We're still listening to someone who knew him very well, his own son, who, by the way, if you go on and watch that, he was 11 years old when the movie came out. Think about how wild that was and what an experience that was. And then how he spent 40-some years being a park ranger on his family's estate. He's spoken a lot. These guys have spoken a lot at the World War I Museum and have been very involved in the World War I Museum. As far as the film goes itself, I want to say a few things about the film itself as we kind of conclude and then take any questions you might have. But as far as the film itself goes, it is patriotic. So it is a good story in the sense that they intended it to be a good story. They wanted it to be an uplifting story because it felt like one. But that's not just because they wanted to make it Hollywoodish and sweet and all that. It's because of this. Alvin York counted himself very blessed. He counted himself blessed to have survived. He counted him blessed to have had the experiences he'd had. When he came back from Europe, when the war was over, he was given all kinds of gifts. He was given every award known to man. You heard he got the Medal of Honor. He got the Croix de Guerre. He had all kinds of honors, awards. He got land. He got a home. He got a free honeymoon. He got given a lot of things. He felt richly blessed. He did not want the movie to come off as like he was hurt, injured, harmed. He wanted to come off as he was thankful. very thankful. So that was a lot of his input into the movie. So that's kind of all over the movie in many, many ways. Now they shot battle scenes, and for many people, those were some of the better battle sequences of World War I up to that point in time. Of course, it's going to change a lot in the next decade, and World War II is going to come. So, but anyway, I love Sergeant York, and again, it's patriotic, but I love it. It comes out about the same time as Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Filmmaking then, after this movie comes out, World War II is all over us. And we don't stop making movies, but we, of course, now we're making movies after 1941 that are connected to the moment. So one of the things I want to say in summary of all this today, is you look at the movies we talked about before, whether it's Stagecoach and Gone with the Wind, all these, they're looking back. When the World War II gets on us from 1941 to about 1948, we see a lot of it's right now. It's now, because they need to. Of course, that's what you're seeing in newsreels in the theaters, but we kind of see a turn in filmmaking. And then, of course, post-World War II, we'll see something very, very different, certainly as we get into the 50s. So do you have any questions? I hope you've enjoyed the discussion of some of these films. I could say so much more, tried to bring some historical components to it. I'm excited because now we'll come towards the modern era eventually. Here we'll kind of have a 60s, 70s, 80s next week kind of discussion of some films. And then the last week I'll talk about films that have been made in the last 10 or 20 years, because we've got some still great films being made, of course, great ones. But any questions you have? Well, if you think about them, you can still ask next week. Thanks for coming, and I'll see you guys next week.